Hi, and welcome to Ran in Focus, a podcast brought to you by the Radicalization Awareness Network.
I'm Jordy Nijenhuis.
And I'm Veera Tuomala.
And today we will be talking to frontline practitioners and experts about grooming tactics on video gaming platforms. And also what we as practitioners can do to counter or prevent this.
So I work for Save the Children Finland on a project called Radical Web, and we aim to counter and prevent violent extremism and radicalization in young people. And we do that by training youth workers on the subject. How about you, Jordy?
I live in a little village called Berkel in Roderijs. It's just outside Rotterdam, here in the Netherlands. I'm a co-founder of Dare to Be Grey, an organization that tries to counter polarization by building a platform for the grey middle ground of society. And I'm also a trainer at the RNTC Training Center, where I train journalists, media professionals to counter radicalization in many countries around the world.
We're actually both doing this as members of the Radicalization Awareness Network, or RAN, which is a network of professionals and practitioners
working together to counter this very important challenge that we're all facing. Luckily, today we can zoom in on one topic, and that is gaming and how grooming tactics are being used on video gaming.
Well, it does seem to be something that's continuously increasing, but in general, we know that terrorists and extremists are very digitally savvy. If you think about their, use of cryptocurrencies and how they message each other and everything, it's just they're really ahead of the curve when it comes to that.
So our first guest has been looking closely at the impact of violent extremism on the world of offline gaming, particularly from the far right. His name is John Christian Lange. He works for Save the Children in Denmark as a senior advisor on online and social media. Hi, John.
Hello.
And I believe you've met Veera already, right? You're working for the same organization.
Yeah, we are. I was so fortunate to talk to her last year in the spring, just before the pandemic, I think.
Yeah, it was actually right when I had started with Save the Children and this project.
And I know you've been working online as well for a long time already. Maybe you can start with talking about that for a bit.
When I started, it was small social media platforms. We had one large one in Denmark that had almost 1 million users. And then Facebook came, and during 1 year, they were down to under 40,000. So we could see the big impact that the big social media had.
Do you also have some experience with the downsides or the bad sides of online gaming?
Yeah, a lot actually, because at Save the Children, we are there to help children that are in exposed positions, and the 15 most vulnerable children, children in the world. We actually that's sort of our target. So and in that sense, I have encountered a lot of bad stuff also on the internet, where it's not just grooming for now you want to be a radicalized person, but actually just grooming via trolling a lot. We can see that during a conversation about, for instance, football or Fortnite, it's sort of like a trolling army or trolling persons coming and just being there to ruin the conversation. And then when everybody's just starting arguing, they sort of like, well, I know a place where you can actually have your opinions. So if you can join me on another platform, just go and be my friend there. So we can see there are grooming attempts on a lot of platforms, not only on social media, but also in the gaming.
So what kind of platforms are they using then to move these people from like the more public spaces like Fortnite, Facebook? What kind of platforms are they using to go a bit more deeper?
Forums like 8con and 4chan, and from that going into more private settings and private rooms that are not only platforms anymore, but groups, interest groups on for instance, Facebook or other places. So there's a huge link between grooming for radicalization and in the sort of the dark web, but also in the in the more public web. Especially during Corona, we can see a huge increase on every platform that we encounter here in Denmark.
Because everything's become, so digital, everything's moving online, people are spending more time online. Is that purely the reason, or do you think that there's something else here that maybe extremists are using it as an opportunity? Or
there was just this week, the Copenhagen City launched a research paper where you can see that 42% of parents during Corona lockdown has encountered that their children has been exposed to very hateful language, and some of it also was targeted a lot, and it sounded like a lot of radicalization attempts. And we could see that a huge part of that was on the gaming communities, especially multimedia online games like Fortnite and Among Us. So that was a huge eye-opener for us, like 42%, that's a lot.
So in your work, you advise people on how to kind of act around this phenomenon. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So we started an education of policemen and lawyers and teachers and pedagogues to the people that are around the children, to make them understand the values and the cultural aspect that are in gaming. So it's not, because we could see there was a trend that it's only gaming, it's not the real life. We don't really need to bother about it because it's just some playful stuff. Then, of course, we talk about and making plans on how to address that to the parents and the teachers and other children. But actually, like 80% of the education is so how to be there before anything bad happens.
And do you have any tips for us as practitioners to start these conversations?
2 tips. One of it is you need to invest some time in understanding the digital world. You really need to, because you can't talk about YouTube when your child is on 4chan. And you can actually talk about heyday when your child is doing a Fortnite. So you really need to understand which specific media or game your child really wants to be on. But then also what we found out during the education is that actually if you're dealing with a bunch of people that really have a hard time understanding the digital world, actually it's good sometimes to delete all the digital context and just say, well, when everything comes down, when we strip all the digital and the gaming industry from the just world of being a child, it's about emotions, understanding that you can be hateful and you can be angry and you can be sad and you can be happy as well. But actually talking about emotions, understanding what's behind the emotions, sometimes it's actually one of what the kids really want to have addressed with the adults. It's mostly to cope with their feelings of distress or sadness or anger. It was a huge eye-opener for us, and actually a place where we start every time.
So sometimes it feels like this gaming community or these gaming communities are so unique. Do you think that we as practitioners have credibility there?
It's very hard when you are not a very good gamer to have credibility. So I think if we somehow could have amazing gamers, also be pedagogues and teachers and people that would be online, that would be an issue. But you really need to have that special skill. Otherwise, they would just leave the room and go to another server.
What would you say that are the next steps in what we can do going forward with this issue?
Well, the next step for me is, and off top of my to-do list for 2021, is to address this to the gaming industry and have a good talk and making plans for how to deal with this for the next year.
That sounds like a fantastic plan, John. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
So John made some really excellent points there and just also kind of addressed what he still needs to find out. But there were some pretty alarming statistics from what they found out from the Copenhagen area on, 42% of parents have found that their children have experienced something like this online.
And it also seems like something new, right? It's this specific culture for young people, all communicating privately online on a scale that we've never seen before. That makes it challenging for us as practitioners to really understand what is going on. They communicate in a specific way. They are using private servers we don't have access to. I think we definitely need to look into those issues and see what we can uncover.
Oh, absolutely. And really talk to people who are both in the community, but also experts who know a lot about it.
And I know that one guy is definitely keeping his eye on gaming platforms.
Ross Frenna is a working group leader for Rand's Communications and Narratives Working Group. He's also founder of Moonshot, a specialist organization that develops innovative and emerging methodologies to counter violent extremism. Okay, so Ross, are you a gamer at all?
I am a very old-fashioned kind of a gamer. I game regularly. I have a clan. We've been playing together for the bones of 20 years because we started playing strategy games like Age of Empires and Command and Conquer in the late 90s and have kept it up ever since.
So how did you end up with studying gaming in relation to radicalization then?
7 years ago, there were folks that used to kind of laugh that they didn't understand the internet and think, oh, isn't that funny, as if the internet was for children. When we now all understand that if you claim to be an expert on extremism, you have to understand the role that the internet plays in that. The same is also true of gaming. It's not a minority pursuit, and it's not funny to not understand the differences between those things. A majority of Americans and a majority of Europeans are gamers. So there's still this idea that a gamer is kind of an angry young man in his mother's basement. That is an incredibly old-fashioned way of viewing things. So putting that into context, say, okay, well, the majority of people are gamers. We then start thinking about gaming culture. You said culture first. Gaming culture and gaming cultural references are highly common throughout kind of broader internet subculture. Even if you don't come from that subculture, it's not that hard to learn that gamification is different from gaming culture, is different from modding, and is different from creation of bespoke games. And for anyone who wants to know about those categories, I would direct them towards the paper that my working group put out only a couple of months ago, where we do break down those categories and also give examples of where those specific things have happened.
Because there are so many stereotypes, and you're talking about, people making kind of lazy connections there, how big of a problem would you say it actually is then?
If we're asking about gaming, we need to break it down into its constituent parts. When we think about gaming and extremism, we need to think about the difference between gaming cultural references, gamification, the modification of games to produce new ones, and also the utilization of gaming adjacent communications platforms. Each of these problems is distinct. They all require distinct responses, and it requires just a little bit of cultural knowledge from policymakers and journalists and others to pull those things apart. Because if you push them all together, then it sounds scary and it makes for a great article, but it doesn't make for good policy.
Do you think it's more of a communication problem, Len, than that it's a problem with this community per se?
Yeah, absolutely. I do not think there is a problem with the gaming community. I think I think that, to be clear, gaming culture has problems with misogyny, and gaming culture has a whole bunch of problems. But there's a difference between saying a community has some problems and there's a causal link between being part of that community and becoming a terrorist. Those are completely different things. So, and this is where we sometimes get mixed up, is you have very worthwhile efforts to try and highlight some of the problems that exist within gaming culture, which are totally legitimate. You then have scare stories that go on about, oh my God, ISIS have created a computer game, when they haven't. They've just modded something. And then you have some great research that goes on into gamification. And in the minds of people that don't know what the hell they're talking about, it all just gets melded into one big pot, and we all kind of have to sit around and say, like, what are we going to do about gamers?
So I get what you're saying, that maybe we're looking at this gamer community from a wrong angle. But on the other hand, we see that some games are being developed or modded by these communities. Take HiMap Defender, for example, from the identitarian movement. They still use these tools. How big of a threat do you think it is? And maybe can you explain what these games look like for the people like us who haven't seen a game like this ever?
And I think that what we need to remember when we see, games like HiMap Defender and these other ones, is that these games are just terrible. Like, they're appallingly bad. No one is going to become an extremist because they played some knocked together 2-bit platform game that some guy put together. That's not going to happen. The reason these groups make these games is, ironically, so they can get a media splash. Because by making a game like this, they're not hoping to recruit thousands of people. They're hoping that some journalist or someone else will pick up on it, lose their minds, and give them loads of free publicity, which is exactly what happened with that game. The game was removed from platforms, from streaming platforms, in less than 24 hours. This game did not have an impact on radicalization in Europe. What did have an impact is people's response to it legitimized the group and made them seem like they were bigger and badder than they were. We've seen this in the past. You know, when ISIS minted its own coins, we all thought, oh my God, how legitimate are they? Them minting their own coins had no impact at all. But it was an attempt by those groups to project competency. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that when these folks do things for publicity, we don't play right into their hands. And unfortunately, consistently, that's what we do. And you're much less likely to understand that if either you, the journalist, you, the policymaker, or anyone around you has ever played games. Because any gamer could glance at that and say, yeah, this is appalling, no one's ever going to play it.
It definitely does sound like there is an opportunity for practitioners and policymakers and, you know, anyone working in the space to also engage gamers with absolutely massive platforms. They have huge platforms. Do you think that would be a good outlet for practitioners to use? Or
so something that we're hoping to do, that we at Moonshot are hoping to do, and we're hoping to encourage others to do this year, is to try and set up pilot programs that mirror sports for PCVE, but instead esports for PCVE. So identifying vulnerable folks, getting them into esports teams, and seeing if we can use that to actually guide people away. But this is fresh territory. This is new ground. And I think if there's new interest in this, if there's new focus on this, then I would love practitioners and policymakers and others to be thinking about creative, positive ways to engage with this instead of acting like we can shut down the internet and wind back the clock, because we can't.
So gaming and gamification seems to be higher up the agenda of PCVE practitioners, especially in the last year, right? Do you think that COVID-19 and people working from home and becoming more digital has an impact on these discussions?
Yeah, there's no doubt that as people are spending more time indoors, there is higher degrees of isolation. People are spending more time online. And you know, the digital space, all digital spaces hold some risk of radicalization. So I think that's unsurprising. The disappointing thing from my perspective of where the discourse has gone is that there are so many opportunities to use so kind of the internet and use social spaces online in a positive sense. And instead of grasping those opportunities and thinking creatively about how we can do things like use esports, use gaming as a positive social outlet, we've fallen back to the same kind of discourse that we had literally in the mid-1990s about, oh my God, the kids are on the internet, and if we just get them outside to kick a ball, then we wouldn't have terrorism. So what I would really like practitioners to be doing and other folks to be thinking about is accepting the fact that we don't live in the 1950s, computer games are a part of people's lives, and then thinking about, okay, how can we use esports in a positive way? Because esports, which again for the uninitiated among you is what more serious gamers call gaming, esports have all sorts of wonderful social benefits. They give people a social outlet, they give people meaning in their lives.
thank you so much, Ross, for joining us. You just have incredible insight into this world of gaming, and just, if you have anything else that you just really want to get out there and tell the practitioners who are listening to this, or anyone else listening to this.
The overarching message is don't be scared. This stuff it seems really daunting, but as a practitioner, you can learn quite quickly some of the key points in this. And then likewise, for all practitioners everywhere, think of gaming the same way you think of football. Football, if played by a club that has, that has a really racist undertone, can be used for bad purposes. But football can also bring people together. Esports and gaming can bring people together. You can use it in your work. It's not scary. Engage with it, think about it, and that's how we're going to be able to push back against this.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks both. It's wonderful to be on.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you had so many valid points. For me specifically, the fact that it may feel like a strange world, something we don't really understand, and that causes a lot of communication issues, right?
Absolutely.
We don't know how to talk about these issues. We may even amplify their propaganda in a way by just talking about these games that are actually rubbish. So yeah, definitely an eye-opener. How about you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really often just a missed opportunity from policymakers and practitioners and, anyone outside of the community that we're actually talking about to not talk to the community and not engage with esports or, gamers in general and these massive platforms that they have. Our next and final guest is going to help us take this chat to kind of the next stage. Linda Schlegel is an academic from Goethe University in Frankfurt, and she is interested not just in gaming, but gamification.
Hi, Linda. So you're interested in gaming and gamification. Yeah, it seems to be fairly new, especially when it comes to PvE, CvE. So maybe can you help us with explaining what is gamification actually, and what's the difference between gaming and gamification?
I apply gamification as meaning the transfer of game elements such as points and quests and leaderboards into a non-gaming context. So if I'm not developing a full game, but I'm taking some of the elements that make gaming interesting and that sort of draw people towards playing and apply that in a context that is not a game.
Very interesting. And do you think there's a link between social media and the likes and the scoring and maybe even gaming attention on social media and the gamification of extremism?
I think gamification can be used online and offline, but it works best online. And so actually social media platforms like you collect likes and stuff like that. So that's a form of gamification. It's a form of points and a form of social status. The more likes you have, the cooler you feel. Basically, I mean, that's what the influencers thrive on. And that's a form of gamification. And there's actually research that shows that people sort of working out and then posting their stuff on social media work out more because then they get more likes. So I think there's definitely a connection between the sort of ever-growing presence of the online world in our daily lives and the gamification that's been taking place, not just in terms of like the extremist context, but in terms of like any form of social interaction.
Would you say that there are any kind of specific things that appeal to extremists when it comes to gamification?
It's entertainment, it's part of pop culture and youth culture, and to use that, of course, in radicalization or in propaganda is very smart because it draws people towards you. I also think that there are other psychological mechanisms that extremists could make use of in gamifying their propaganda to sort of make the content more appealing and maybe most importantly, make people log back on. Because as we know, it's not enough to just watch a YouTube video and suddenly you're radicalized. It needs to be some form of prolonged interaction with the extremist content. And if I'm gamifying my content and users like that and they're like, hey, that's cool, I'm going to do that again. I'm going to participate in that raid and I'm going to post on the forum and look where I am on the leaderboard. And wow, it's so empowering to get all this positive feedback because I get X amount of likes for my comments, etc. You're just more likely to log back on because as humans, we want to feel that sort of validation that we get from the gamification.
So it actually sounds like these elements of gamification are well suited for PvE, CvE campaigning. Do you have any tips or examples of how to implement these elements?
So it's not going to be enough to just say, oh, let's throw some points around and let's see what's going to happen. But always ask yourself, what do I want my user to feel? What do I want them to do, but also how do I want them to do it and what do I want them to enjoy from what I'm doing? That's one thing. The other thing is sort of how do we apply this practically? If we look at sort of the lower end of sophistication, let's say, you could start with something very simple, like make a caption contest on Instagram and the comment with the most likes, so collecting points, they win. You could have like the best 3 comments on the leaderboard, like in a different Instagram post, sort of acknowledging them and you did well and giving them a sort of social status. You could even sort of give the person who wins a reward. Maybe they get a shout out, but this could also be some sort of offline reward. It doesn't, it depends on the type of intervention that you're doing and your target audience. That would be something to decide. But that could be something that's very sort of low threshold, low sophistication, but that might actually sort of increase engagement with your content. And then in the future, obviously that's not going to be enough. I mean, extremists are also going to become more sophisticated in the gamified elements they apply. And so PCVE will have to sort of follow suit. And if it's working, it might make sense to sort of talk to game designers, talk to people who are actually sort of experts on gamifying non-gaming context. Like, how do I do this? How do I not just bore people with collecting points? How do I construct a story around what I'm doing, but still make it low threshold so that I don't have to read 3 pages of story in terms of, just entering a caption contest, etc. So going forward, that's definitely something that we need, this sort of cooperation with not just the tech sector that sort of hosts the content, which is done already, but also asking what can we learn from the people who are doing gamification.
Yeah, and that learning curve is always super important, trying to kind of keep up with not just technology, but also the technology that extremists use. Do you think that this is something that as practitioners we should all be doing, or at least thinking about applying to our work?
So I think what we need is sort of specialized people who do the monitoring, who sort of speak the language of the gamified of the gaming community, and sort of know what's going on passively, as in sort of a passive vocabulary that they have, so they can read all the abbreviations and understand what's going on, what's the narrative behind it. But then obviously you also need someone with an active vocabulary in this if you want to sort of apply it to your own work. Because I think the problem with gamification could be, in terms of PCVE, that very quickly it could become gimmicky. Like, you're making something, you're trying to make something cool, like teachers used to do in school. They thought, oh, I'm going to do this and this, and it's going to be so cool for the teenagers. They're going to love it. And then they'll just like, no, this is not cool at all. And that's the risk if you're not if you don't have that active vocabulary and sort of what am I doing with the gamification, very easily it could be just a laugh for people. And that's obviously not what we want.
Thank you so much for kind of clarifying on what the differences are between gaming and gamification. It's definitely something that is needed to focus on.
There's going to be a proliferation of gamification in all areas of life, and sort of, hiding underneath the table and saying, oh, we might not need this, we don't need to engage with this. I think that's the worst we could do. And if we're fast enough with the gamification thing and understanding what it does to our world as a whole, but also to extremists operating within our societies, we might actually be one step behind and not 2 like we usually are.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really fun talking to you. And I wish you good luck with your next step in exploring the world of gamification.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, based on what Linda said, as well as, all of the guests that we've had on today, it just kind of sounds like we're kind of at a cultural crossroads in where we really need to focus on this and realize how big of an impact and how big of an influence the gaming community can have on not just violent extremism, or extremism in general, but like PCVE and everything, that we really need to focus on that community and really utilize them in our work.
And we can learn from these techniques and use them to our advantage. So that sounds pretty exciting, actually.
It's a whole new avenue that is as yet quite unexplored, so that's super interesting to kind of focus on that as well.
Thanks for listening to RAN in Focus, a podcast brought to you by the Radicalization Awareness Network.
We'd once again like to thank our contributors for talking to us today, as well as our listeners for tuning in. Please let us know your thoughts and comments below.
Maybe you'll earn some points.
Bye.
Bye.